people in support of the Second Amendment are actually making a pro-gun grabber argument against the Defend the Guard Act. Good morning, and thank you for joining me on the Path to Liberty. I'm Michael Bolden with the 10th Amendment Center, and this is the Fast Friday edition of the show for March 22nd, 2024. Thank you so much for spending some of your time with me today. Let's get right to it. We're going to talk about the Defend the Guard Act, one of the most important pieces of 10th Amendment legislation that exists for the states. But many friends of liberty, generally supporters of the right to keep and bear arms, the Second Amendment, they've fallen into a trap. And what they're doing by accident, possibly, is they're using a pro-gun grabber view of the right to keep and bear arms, that it doesn't exist as an individual right, but instead only as a collective right and only for the National Guard. And they're using that same framework to tell us the Defend the Guard Act has a fatal flaw. Hopefully this is going to make some sense here. First, to Mike Meharry, he points out that Defend the Guard is a state-level bill that would stop the deployment of a state's National Guard units unless specific constitutional criteria are met. It would prohibit deployment to active duty combat unless Congress has passed a declaration of war or taken official action pursuant to Article 1, Section 8, Clause 15 of the Constitution to explicitly call forth the Guard for one of three enumerated purposes: to execute the laws of the Union, to suppress insurrections, to repel invasions. Those of you who have read the Constitution and do so regularly, which I do encourage, will recognize this language coming from Article 1, Section 8, Clause 15 of the Constitution, which says the Congress shall have power to provide for calling forth the militia to execute the laws of the Union, suppress insurrections, and repel invasions. And also Article 1, Section 8, Clause 16. These are the militia clauses. Congress shall have power to provide for organizing, arming, and disciplining the militia, and for governing such part of them as may be employed in the service of the United States, reserving to the states, respectively, the appointment of the officers and the authority of training the militia according to the discipline prescribed by Congress. Now, a quick but important aside here. When we think of the word provide or to provide for, they used it quite differently at the time of ratification. Hear from Rob Nadelson. And this article, along with all the original source documents and other articles, etc., that I'm going to be mentioning in this episode, will be included in the show links section of a blog post for this episode and every episode that we publish over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path-to-liberty. Alan Mosley gets that organized. I will get it published a couple hours after this live stream is done. But here to Nadelson. He says, today we usually employ the verb provide to mean to give, as in she provided him with cash. This was not the usual way the term was used in the 18th century. We're, of course, talking about an 18th century legal document, the Constitution. He said, then the term usually had an aspect of futurity in it, suggested by its Latin forebear, providere, meaning to look ahead or predict, and still captured in the modern English term provision, as in he is making provision for the future. Now, in Samuel Johnson's Dictionary of 1755, he writes, the first definition of to provide is, quote, to procure beforehand, to get ready, to prepare. And in the Constitution, to provide for was always meant as one of making provision for the future, as in to take care of beforehand. So Congress has the power, has been delegated the power to provide for calling forth the militia. It doesn't say that Congress shall have the power to provide, to call forth the militia, just that they can make the rules about doing so. Same with the organizing. Article 1, Section 8, Clause 15 and 16 both use this phrase to provide for. Now, we have a few examples of Congress doing this in the Washington administration. So first of all, on September 29th, 1789, they passed an act to basically update some rules about troops and militia that was passed under the Articles of Confederation to make them conform to the Constitution. It authorized the president to, quote, call into service from time to time such part of the militia of the states, respectively, as he may judge necessary for the purposes aforesaid to deal with hostile incursions of the Indian tribes. And then that September 1789 act was just a stopgap, and it had a sunset date. So Washington asked them to reauthorize, and he gave them reasons why. I covered it in another episode and in this article that I'm reading from by Mike Meharry. Did Meharry write this? No, he helped me put this together. He took my notes from the episode on this and helped organize it into an article. Awesome work on this. So on April 30th, 1790, after Washington had requested an extension on this, Congress passed another act giving him 3 more years for the purpose of aiding the troops now in service or to be raised by this act in protecting the inhabitants of the frontiers of the United States. The president is hereby authorized to call into service from time to time such part of the militia of the states, respectively, as he may judge necessary for the purpose aforesaid. So this is Congress providing for the process of calling forth the militia and telling the president what he can do and in what situations. Then we also get 2 militia. They call it the Militia Act of 1792, but there were actually 2 of them passed. The first one on the 2nd of May and the second one on the 8th of May. On the first one was titled An Act to Provide for Calling Forth the Militia to Execute the Laws of the Union, Suppress Insurrections, and Repel Invasion. Just the same language from the text of the Constitution. They just took that Clause 15 and said, this is an act to provide for doing this, that you've delegated a power to us. And it says this, whenever the United States shall be invaded or be in imminent danger of invasion from any foreign nation or Indian tribe, it shall be lawful for the President of the United States to call forth such number of the militia of the state or states most convenient to the place of danger or scene of action as he may judge necessary to repel such invasion and to issue his orders for that purpose to such officer or officers of the militia as he shall think proper. So they're providing for the process and making some boundaries, at least some, for how President Washington can call forth the militia. And then 6 days later, the second one of 1792 was to provide for the national defense by establishing a uniform militia throughout the United States. So they're organizing and training every, quote, free, able-bodied white male citizen. Not the entirety of the people then, but they were also just age 18 through 44. I know if you read the act, it says 45, but it says under the age of 45. And those are the people who would be eligible for the militia to be called for federal duty. So at that point in 1792, Congress said the part of the militia being the whole body of the people, we'll get to that in a minute, but the part that they were going to organize to be called forth were just free, able-bodied white male citizens 18 through 44. Then in 1795, they repealed the 1792 acts and just reiterated it, but expanded the president's authority to call forth the militia. I think it was just from 2 years at that time to as long as he needed. So these are a series of acts. I think much of this really comes from Henry Knox, the Secretary of War, his plan for the militia, which he sent to George Washington in early 1790, and part of it says this: an energetic national militia is to be regarded as the capital security of a free republic and not a standing army forming a distinct class in the community. Now, finally, we're going to get to it. Here's where the gun grabber argument comes in. Of course, we know there are people who absolutely hate the natural right of self-defense. They hate the right to keep and bear arms, and they want to twist the meaning of the Second Amendment. They want us to believe that it has nothing to do with an individual right to keep and bear arms. Well, it really it's a restriction on government to not infringe on the natural right of self-defense, the right to keep and bear arms of individuals. They want us to believe that it is only a collective right. It can only be exercised by people who are in the militia, and the people to them who are in the militia are just the National Guard. So there are people, and there are a growing number of people in the gun-grabbing community who want to push things forward to say that unless you are signed up for the Guard, you have zero right to keep and bear arms, unless they just decide to give you permission. So it'll be up to them. So let's fast forward on this to Title 32 U.S. Code, Chapter 1, Section 101. Again, this will be linked to in the show notes. It gives some definitions. This is talking about the Guard. They're talking about for purposes of other laws relating to the militia, the National Guard, Army National Guard of the United States, and Army National Guard of the United States. Another definition, Army National Guard means that part of the organized militia of the several states and territories. And the Air National Guard means that part of the organized militia of the several states and territories, Puerto Rico, District of Columbia, etc. But they are trained and has its officers appointed under the 16th clause of Section 8, Article 1 of the Constitution. So again, pointing to the militia clause right there in Title 32 U.S. Code. And here, the U.S. Army Center of Military History references, this is the act that everyone points us to say, okay, the Defend the Guard Act saying that they can't call forth the National Guard in regard unless they're following the militia clauses of the Constitution, because that's the restriction. Well, the National Guard has nothing to do with the militia. The Dick Act made a national force. But here, from the Army Center of Military History, they point out that the Militia Act of 1903, which was what the title of it was before it got the more popular name after Congressman Charles Dick. So the Militia Act of 1903, together with its 1908 amendment, was, in the words of a leading historian of the Guard, quote, the most important national legislation in militia history. So the act, also known as the Dick Act, in honor of Charles Dick, repealed the Militia Act of 1792. That's actually incorrect. It repealed the Act of 1795 because 1792 was already repealed, and divided the militia into two groups. The reserve militia, defined as all able-bodied men between 18 and 45, and the organized militia, defined as state units receiving federal support. That is, the organized militia is what they created with the National Guard. This is, again, now if you go back to 1792, Congress decided that they were only going to organize part of the whole body of the people to be called forth for service if General Washington or President Washington actually wanted to do so or felt that he needed to do so. The act gave the president the power to call the organized militia, that is the Guard, the National Guard, into federal service for up to 9 months to repel invasion, suppress rebellion, or enforce laws, federal laws, but not for service outside the United States. The 1908 Act, they amended it. The 9-month limit was removed, and so was the ban on sending National Guard troops overseas. Also in the Constitutional Charter of the Guard. This is an old page from the National Guard that's been archived. I'm not sure where they've updated to, but they've changed their their URL structure, but we've been using this for quite a long time. And they say the Army National Guard's charter is the Constitution of the United States. Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution contains a series of militia clauses. So the Guard itself points to the militia clauses as being the charter for the National Guard. Everyone says this is where it comes from. The Dick Act says this is where it comes from. The Army Center of Military History says the National Guard is governed under the militia clauses. It's not the entirety of the militia. It is the organized militia that Congress has decided, the only part of it that they're saying we're going to call forth, or the president can call forth into federal service. They also point to Article 1, Section 8, Clause 15, which tells what the Guard can be called forth for federal duty for. Again, the militia clauses. Now, this is the exact kind of thing, this Dick Act of 1903, and maybe we could also say the Militia Acts of 1792 and 1795, this is the exact kind of thing that the Anti-Federalists railed against during the ratification debates over and over and over. We have to, of course, start out with the fact that the entirety of the militia is the whole body of the people. But they looked at this power delegated to the federal government, and the federal government could determine that they only wanted to organize, arm, and discipline part of the militia. And if they wanted to do that, then it would be possible that they wouldn't arm the militia at all, or maybe they would only arm part of it, or they would just organize part of it. And really, with these acts, especially 1903 and 1908, we're really getting both of what they warned about. And I want to go to Patrick Henry first. Here he is in the Virginia Ratifying Convention telling us that the great object is that every man be armed. So he was very concerned about these militia clauses, because when he read them, he was warning. He's like, well, what if Congress doesn't arm everybody? then we're going to run into a problem. We should be able to take responsibility for arming ourselves here in Virginia, for example. He said, when this power is given up to Congress without limitation or bounds, how will your militia be armed? You trust to chance. For sure I am that the nation which shall trust its liberties in other hands cannot long exist. So he warned that if you pass these militia clauses in 15 and 16 in Article 1, Section 8, then you are relying on Congress doing the right thing. It doesn't require them to arm the entire body of the people. It doesn't require them to fulfill this great object that every man be armed. It just gives them the power to decide to or not. And Patrick Henry did not like that. He was concerned that this would actually, if you think about it, and we'll get a little from Luther Martin on this in just a moment, but if you think about it, if they don't arm everybody, if the population at large is not armed, they're going to be more reliant on professionals, the standing army, the bane of liberty. Anyways, I'll get to that a little bit more in a moment. Here's George Mason, a quote that's very popular from people who point out this argument that the Defend the Guard Act is a fatal flaw because the National Guard is not governed under the militia clauses of the Constitution, even though the Guard itself says it is. Here he's in the Virginia Ratifying Convention saying, I ask, who are the militia? They consist now of the whole people, except a few public officers. Now, some people will point to this and just say, of course, they're just taking it out of context. They say, see, the National Guard is not the militia because it is not the whole people. It's only those people who sign up. This is a national. It's in the name. It's called National Guard. They're federal employees. They take dual enlistment oaths. And so, well, don't read anything else that George Mason said, because the very next sentence gives us the context of what he's talking about and what he's actually warning about. He said, but I can't, let me read it all. I ask, who are the militia? They consist now of the whole people, except a few public officers. But I cannot say who will be the militia of the future day. If that paper on the table, that is the Constitution that they were considering in Virginia in the summer of 1788, if that paper on the table gets no alteration, the militia of the future day may not consist of all classes, high and low, and rich and poor, but may be confined to the lower and middle classes of the people, granting exclusion to the higher classes of the people. So he was warning, it was kind of a class struggle there. He was warning that there would be kind of an aristocracy, something that they got away from. Of course, many anti-federalists referred to various parts of the Constitution as aristocratic. And he was concerned that it would just be the yeomanry, the average person, the lower and middle classes that would have to put their lives on the line to defend the liberty of the people, to defend the country, and you'd get these kind of elites that would never have to do this. He was very concerned about that scenario. He said, if we should ever see that day, the most ignominious punishments and heavy fines may be expected. His great concern was that they would only organize part of the population into the militia that could be called forth into federal service. And so they really did that in the Militia Act of 1792 and then the Dick Act of 1903. Now, if you think about this argument, the Second Amendment does not say a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the militia to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. No, it says the right of the people. So instead of rejecting this argument that the Second Amendment or the right to keep and bear arms only applies to members of the active duty militia, the National Guard, instead of rejecting this as totally absurd, these so-called supporters, or I'm sure the intention is good, but they're really playing defense, and they tacitly accept part of the gun-grabbing argument. If the National Guard is the militia, the entirety of the militia, instead of just the organized part of it, and the right to keep and bear arms can only be restricted to the Guard, then of course, instead of just saying your argument is dumb and wrong, they're saying, well then the National Guard isn't the militia. The right to keep and bear arms only applies to the militia. They're actually accepting that view. Now, Anti-Federalists repeatedly warned that the militia clauses would be used basically the way that we're seeing them used, to decimate the militia, the general population, the people, the whole people, as George Mason put it, in favor of a standing army, the bane of liberty. And here's how Luther Martin put it in January of 1788. He said, when a government wishes to deprive their citizens of freedom and reduce them to slavery, it generally makes use of a standing army for that purpose and leaves the militia in a situation as contemptible as possible, lest they might oppose its arbitrary designs. He was very concerned that the bulwark of liberty, the militia, the armed people of each state, would be decimated by these clauses in the Constitution. He said, in this system, we give the general government every provision it could wish for, and even invite it to subvert the liberties of the states and their citizens, since we give them the right to increase and keep up a standing army as numerous as it would wish, and by placing the militia under its power, enable it to leave the militia totally unorganized, undisciplined, and even to disarm them. And ultimately, this is the kind of system that we have today. They've disregarded this goal that every person be armed, instead creating this professional kind of elite type of a force that George Mason warned about, and therefore it encourages more of a standing army because, as James Madison told us, the best defense against calls for a large permanent standing army is to have a strong, powerful militia so you don't have to call on that professional force all the time. Well, I hope you guys found this interesting. I hope it was educational. I hope, if anything, it made you think. Of course, if you want to help us reach and teach more and more people with this kind of essential foundational information, absolutely nothing helps us do this work more every single day, more than the financial faith and support of our members. You can join us for as little as $2 a month over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. Again, I really appreciate you spending some of your time with me today. I hope you have an awesome weekend, and I hope to see you next week here on the Path to Liberty.